Okay, guys, and we're back with the Two Scoops podcast.
Hey.
Okay. My name's Alexis Butler, and I'm here with
Eli Blesky.
The blessed one, the one and only.
Who's over
And
here?
of course, myself, Branden. How's it going, guys? I don't know if I like this, right? You're like being right next to the guest. This is a whole night. Yeah.
Yes, and so we have a special guest with us today. Similar to last episode, we are going to be bringing somebody on to invite into the conversation, just because, we think that this is a fun new approach, and it's a great way to find resources, find common ground between other people, and so Branden, you want to give a little
Well, I think she can launch her platform.
Okay, or you could just introduce yourself. We'll just let you go on.
I
know that Branden, because obviously Branden found you, and that's how. So
Branden very kindly offered to introduce me, and I said I'll just introduce myself.
So
just like you did ask.
Yes, I did ask. I did ask.
My name's Elena Krell. I taught women's studies at Vassar College for 10 years. And I've been a musician and a queer and trans activist, I would say, for like the last 15 years.
Okay.
Wow. This is exciting. I gotta say that I love
didn't
this
know you
new
did
format.
music though too. That's so cool. I love that.
Yeah.
Oh my God, me too. And I think people that know how to play an instrument and are musically gifted and talented are just 10 times cooler than anybody else. So I'm being so serious too.
So do you play an instrument?
I used to.
Okay.
And I used to sing, as everybody knows.
Yeah,
so,
at the
shut up, Elijah.
The nursing home.
Okay, so you taught women's studies at Vassar for like
10 years.
10 years. 10 years.
Yeah, 2 of those years I was at Dartmouth, but I was still appointed at Vassar. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Between Dartmouth and Vassar.
Yeah.
10 years is a long time. And
it is a long time.
And women's studies at Vassar, I feel like, to be honest, that's kind of iconic.
Yeah, we were talking about this last night on
right?
when we were talking about the planning of the episode. He was just like, it's kind of iconic that you literally worked at one of the, because Vassar was one of the last all-girl colleges. And he was like, it's sick that she taught women's studies at one of those.
One of the last, one of the all girl, because you would think that that's like the fountain, that's the foundation.
I just think that gives you a little bit more credibility too.
Right?
It's like, okay, here I go, I got this on my back,
The Intro to Women's Studies course at Vassar is one of the most popular courses. I wouldn't say almost everybody, but a lot of students take that class. And I taught that pretty much the entire time. And I loved teaching it because you would get some students who have been thinking about gender and sexuality for the last, some of them their whole lives. And then there's some people who are like, really, I don't even feel comfortable speaking because I don't want to offend anyone, but I care about these issues and I want to educate myself. And so it was really great to kind of model how to have conversation about difficult topics that people are really sensitive about and do it in a way that's, assuming the best, being a generous listener and speaker. And it was a lot of what we call in performance studies, which is what I have my doctorate in, sort of the emotional labor, right?
Yeah.
Where you're not just doing the intellectual work of understanding the history of social movements, of understanding histories of imperialism and colonialism that set up ideas around gender and sexuality that we have, but also managing our own and other people's emotions while we're doing that, right?
Because there's so many aspects that tie into the conversation. I literally this because I had told you off camera, I took a couple of classes when I was at college on women and gender studies, and I always thought that they were so interesting just in the approach, like you were just talking about, just in the approach of the way that they taught, because they were teaching it with such, not even a passion, but such just a true understanding of what really went on. And they were the classes that I felt I always thrived in, because I felt I was really gaining knowledge from the professor and what they were giving to me, because it felt like they truly understood what they were talking about and they cared about it and it was personal to them, and it wasn't just material that was put on a syllabus and that just had to be delivered out and we had to learn it for the year. I felt like it was, and it was also interesting too, because this is gender identity and fluidity and sexuality are conversations that come up almost every single day in just day-to-day life. So I think that it's really interesting to see like it all just kind of put out like in like an outline, you know what I mean? And it gives a lot of like insight onto like how broad the whole conversation is.
So
you know?
could you go more into your doctorate? Because you said you got your doctorate, right? What was that actually in?
So it was at Northwestern in Chicago.
Okay.
And it was in the School of Communications. But the way I like to describe it, performance studies as a field, is it's kind of like a hybrid between anthropology and theater studies.
Okay.
So
I just made my
Because like a
eyes light
doctorate
up.
in performance studies, it's like I want to see like or like have at least be able to walk away with a grasp of like that scope.
Wait, so
like your thesis.
I have to
right?
ask, like, you, sorry to interrupt, but like you brought up theater. Like, were you like a theater kid growing up?
I wasn't. I was a music kid. My sister
Okay,
was
well,
a theater
like
kid,
similar
but
though. So like
same-
that, but that just like made my heart so warm because I was one too. So I just love that.
Actually, the first year of the doctorate, we had to do a one-person show, and so
Oh
we
my
conceived it. So there was a performance element to it, but then the rest of the 6 years that I was there, it was like reading and writing like any other PhD.
Yeah.
But so there were wildly different projects. The coolest thing I will say about getting a PhD, which a lot of people don't know this, and I like to share this because it's like sometimes knowledge just gets siloed, right? And only people of certain kind of cultural spaces know these things. But most PhD programs are free.
Wow.
Right? Somebody else paid for my PhD.
Yeah.
And that's important because, we live under capitalism and it's hard to make money. And so if you like to read and write, you can, like, I looked at it as a job while I was studying. But so anyway,
it is a job. Like, it is a job though.
Yeah,
it totally is a job.
Except you get to, and you get to meet friends and kind of everybody's
And experience a
working
different
on
life and like, yeah.
So there was people who were studying like clowning as a revolutionary act in Colombia. There were people who were studying opera. There were people who were studying the performance of identity in everyday life amongst like particular social groups. So the only kind of core thing that brought everybody together was an interest in performance as an analytic. So thinking less about who we are versus what we do.
Yes. Okay.
Like how do we describe the world through the lens of how things are working?
Yeah.
As opposed to what they are.
Well, and I think that like goes really great with the topic of like just gender, like in general, just because it's like, even if like, because like I said before, gender is fluid. So it doesn't, like, you can't just look at somebody and assume, oh, just because like they're, wearing a dress or they're wearing like they have earrings or something like that. You can't just make an assumption off like their gender or their sexuality or who they are as a person just because of what they're presenting on the outside.
Well, yeah, that does leave, the whole identity, that I feel in the past 10 years. So over the 10 years of your time duration there, how did you see it almost like transform or grow? Like did when there was more rights that were starting to be liberated or like more, as people discovered, more identities, like did you constantly have to adjust your curriculum or like were you always kind of like, I guess probably ahead of the game, right? Where you're like prepared for like the trends of like what's happening around the world. Like when you're talking about like, I'm trying to like see the progression of it, right? Because I would say 10 years is a vast different, right? Just like 10 years ago.
A lot can change in 10 years.
Like, yeah, a lot can change. And, even me and Eli were talking about, when I was a kid in high school, and this is, what just playing off through observation, it was just either, homosexual or like metrosexual, there wasn't like, and there were still people who identified as that in high school. I still saw it, and there's people out, but like, obviously you get to this point now where you want to care for people. I didn't know, no matter what anyone's like opinions are, you want to be able to have a general care for people in the sense that you're not just going around offending people because they have a different disposition, right? Mm-hmm. So like trying to traverse that world where there is more identities now that are being introduced or like people have those freedoms and liberties, right? Like to identify as such, right? Like how do you, approaching it and like the presentation of it, the introduction to it, kind of like that situation. So I guess to come back around, it's like, how did you deal with that as it was starting to be like, like as people were being more open and like coming into your classes and being or even challenged, I guess, in that sense too, right? Because you probably dealt with a lot of people just challenging your positions, right? No?
Yeah, it's so I think of like the academy, and by the academy I mean like the industry of like university, like higher education, right? As the kind of and this is just my particular beliefs, right? But as the kind of like intellectual arm of colonialism in a way.
Okay.
Because it, Western institutions of higher learning are they're only 200-300 years old, right? It's relatively recent, and so are disciplines, right? The idea of math, the idea of science, like the creation of disciplines in the institution is a relatively recent phenomenon. So when you're hired as a gender studies professor, you're kind of expected to be an expert, and I am, and I was, but I'm also studying social movements, and to your point, like it's changing, and the idea that one person's supposed to know everything about a like there's just no way, right? So there were, and I had to kind of like walk a very fine line between positioning myself as a certain type of expert, right? Like I'm a professional writer is basically what academics are. Like I was great at teaching students, like I tried to kind of talk about the things that I'm an expert at, but to be like, I don't know your experience. And these categories not only are fluid, but they have babies, right? Like there are things that are born and changed all the time. And so
it's like continued education, I guess, like how you just stuck with like the expertise of like, okay, this is what I know, and then this is what I'm educating them on, and they come they come here to receive that education in that specific, that field.
And it's also okay if I don't know something, right?
Absolutely.
Like I think I think that is hard, right? Like the line between like you want to show up and you want to know, you don't want to be ignorant, quote unquote, right? Like, but we also can't know everything. So there's like this kind of fine line between just being generous and also giving people the information that they need to respect you. And
then as your 10 years of service in education, like was gender studies the only class you taught, or did you have other like curriculum, like a different, other classes, topics, subjects?
I taught in music and in Africana studies and in Latin American Latino studies.
Oh wow!
So I was
like, when I like took classes, like a lot of those professors taught. It was like very similar at my school. Like a lot of those professors taught similar classes, like to what you had just mentioned, and I think it goes back to what you were just saying, where that was something like going back to what I said, that it was what I appreciated about the professors that taught those classes was I knew that they weren't an expert, like you said, but I appreciated the fact that they also knew that they weren't an expert, and that they just had a passion for it because it could affect them. Like what they were talking about did affect them, because a lot of those professors that I had identified as women, and I just thought, like that's a power move too. Like I thought that was so boss bitch. Like you're literally coming here and you're talking about all the terrible things that women have encountered over the millions of years, over like all the different cultures, and you're still and now you're sitting up here teaching about it. Like it's so cool. I just, you know what I mean? And like you just said, it's ever changing, because if you would have said that to somebody years ago, they would have looked at you like there's no way that a woman is teaching a course, let alone about that.
And to be fair, like history is 9 times out of 10 told through a man's view.
Oh, 100%.
Right? Like, so then you're never really learning history.
It was designed,
especially
but it was designed
American
to be
history,
talked about.
So it's like
stuff.
9 times out of 10 we get our history from a man's view. So it's like that history gets shuttered, right?
Yeah.
Like you're not seeing it from the opposite perspective, or even the ones like, or the people, their loved ones, or even, their women and their daughters and their mothers and their lives, who were a part of that process. They're not telling that side of the story, right? Like they're just talking about like control and power and domination, essentially, right? Like integration of like thoughts, right? And system. It's all systematic. So it's definitely.
I remember one day a young woman of color student came up to me and was like, you're the first woman of color teacher I've ever had.
Really?
And
Wow.
It meant so much to me. It's like a flip side of the coin. It's like terrible, right? But on the positive side, it's like, wow, I get to be that for someone, you know?
Yeah.
Just, I'm Honduran on my mom's side. So, you know, it's cool. And it's nice that I'm bilingual with Spanish. So my expertise was queer and trans of color theory.
Wow.
Which is a mouthful, but it essentially means, and we talked about this when we met, when you invited me on the podcast a little bit, but it's being an expert at intersectionality, right? At thinking about how gender, race, sexuality, class, nation, ability, et cetera, when you're looking at the deep intersections, right? So something that I would love thinking about and talking about is how, like, for example, for women of color, depending on what culture they're a part of, their experience of being female is different from each other and from white women, right? Yeah. So when we talk about feminism or when we talk about women's rights, we have to be kind of really nuanced and specific about what we're talking about, because some of the struggles overlap and some of them are wildly different.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of my favorite thing to think about and talk about.
Yeah. Him and I, like when I looked at both of our questions, we literally had like a similar like thing, like
kind of idea.
Idea when it comes to like you talking about that. But I was just like talking just about how like even just now with like the ongoing women's rights crisis that we're currently living in, like it's not just here within our country, it's across so many other cultures. And, you know, while the media focuses so much on what's going on here right now, it's like there's worse things that are going on in other countries that are like not being talked about enough and have been going on for years and years and years, and we still don't talk about it, you know? So I think
it's in the US, all the media you see is kind of filtered to you and tailored to you, but it doesn't really give you the accurate
accurate depiction of what is going on everywhere in the world
to the other cultures and the other people that don't have that platform.
Yeah, most countries don't have that platform, and I would say that that's a huge, like, going into what you're saying, when you get introduced into these studies of like, you have to understand that you're really coming from the point of like the history that we have here and the rights that we have here, because what they're used to in their homes or their upbringing, they would have never experienced that, or thought that they could, right? Like even if like, and that's a broad range. That's people coming from Liberia or from Colombia or Central America or even the Ukraine, you know, like the way that women are, I feel like you said, it is a crisis around the world, but then you also can't get too hyperfixated on like some of the rights and liberties that we do have here just overall, because they're able to express that, right? Like you're able to actually expand on it, where in some places it's a crime to even, right? Like to even like talk up or to even speak about it.
But also like for people, like I guess like it's just like speaking for myself and like for just women in this country, like Elijah said, like obviously they're going to focus more on like the things that are going to directly affect them, where it's like, yeah, that in a sense, like selfish isn't the right term, but in a sense, like it can be a little bit just like you're only thinking about yourself. You're not thinking about, you know, just all the women in the whole world that are also going through other things. But obviously, like
self-preservation.
I don't know, I feel like for some people, I think that they just believe the more that they can do within their own community here, it's like there's hope for there being like an end in sight, like at some point, or like just like a chain reaction, or just like more, I don't know, just like more like light on awareness, like what is going on and awareness on what is going on elsewhere. You know what I mean? Yeah.
I definitely hear that. I mean, I could see the struggles and such with it. Obviously I have a skewed perspective on this stuff because I'm a man. So I feel like this has led to like the fuck men movement for like the past like 8 years, you know, and it's not to like be a victim, but it's like you have to be aware that like it becomes difficult to communicate, you know, when there's already a disposition of like a combative nature, or like you are already being stigmatized, like to even try to give a conversation, to even try to like express yourself with compassion and care could come off, you know, the wrong way. So then you have like a generation of tentative men who don't really even want to communicate. You know, they don't even want to express themselves or are struggling with finding that level of vulnerability with their partner because they how many times have they gone out and heard F men, or you know what I mean, or they've been around, you know, loved ones even that who they even cared about who had skewed dispositions about the gender, you know what I mean? So it's like where do we get to like a point of like reasoning, you know what I mean, in conversation, like a mutual ground, rather than it being this like contentual, because I feel like that was great to get it off the ground, right? Like for the movement to start, right? Like I feel like, but we're kind of like past that, right? Like now when does the discussion happen when we're like, okay, could we get back to like being comfortable around each other again? Because it doesn't necessarily feel comfortable. And I'm just being opinion, you know, I mean, this is obviously opinion.
No,
like, you know, it doesn't necessarily feel comfortable when you engage now and have conversation with the opposite sex.
I think that after what you just said, like this was a question I have for you, and it would bounce good off of what you just said, was like, do you like feel that like when it comes to like gender identities in like this day and age, like people are more resistant or like receptive to the discussion of gender?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that because Branden's point earlier, or your question earlier of like, how did it change over 10 years and people getting more accepting and more identities? And this is kind of depressing, but it's true, so I'll say it. When I came out as like non-binary / trans in like 2008, I was part of a small community of artists in Chicago. This is when I was getting my doctorate. And at that time, trans was like very underground. Like there was really not a ton of people talking about it. It felt my partner at the time was making a film about trans musicians, just partly because nobody even knew that they existed. And we went to see the film, and it was this really kind of like feeling that we were doing something like not clandestine, but like something important.
Pioneering, yeah.
Yeah. And I never would have imagined that we would get to where we are now. And I do want to, I'm going to talk about women and men too, but I'm starting with the trans piece because
Please.
Right now there are more anti-trans bills on the docket than there have ever been in the history of the world.
Right.
Yeah, well, it's like,
And
do you feel like we're like going backwards?
There's Roe versus Wade, right? There's all of these things. So the visibility for trans in particular, like in some ways didn't help us. Right? Like the people are just at...
The more aware people became, the more individual opinions started to take light, right?
Right.
Is that what you're getting? Like,
and it's the co-opting, like the way the right, for example, has co-opted the term woke.
Yeah.
And I think there's some anti-blackness in the way that they've done that too, because woke comes from African American vernacular, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's like a kind of anti-black angle to it, I think. But the way that, you know, we did all this work to become visible, but then they kind of use that against us, and violence, for example, on especially trans women of color has not reduced, right? If anything, it's worse because people now know about people being trans, right? So there's less flying under the radar. The wage gap for women is exactly the same as it was 20 years ago. So that hasn't gotten better. So I don't want to say I'm pessimistic, but I just want to say I'm surprised, because when I was in my late 20s, and it took me that long to come out as trans, right? Because there wasn't any visibility, so I didn't understand. I didn't have that. I didn't have access to that language even for myself until then. Yeah, which is right part of what that has changed, which is great. But it is. I never would have imagined that we have gotten the visibility that we have, but the way that it's been used against us. Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting.
It's almost like a numbers game. It's like, okay, like we made it visible, but now we'll use our prowess to like, cause we out, you know, to put these things on the,
that's like the issue with like societies. Like we do that with almost everything. Like we always do that.
Yeah,
and it sucks.
We're not wrong. You want people to be safe, and you definitely don't want to contribute to violent speech or like hateful thought. And like definitely that, which is one of those things that like when you brought it up earlier, when you said you worked with different culturals and like, you know, different ethnicities, it's like I know for a lot of nationalities growing up, at least in my background, that just did not accept gayness or any type of queer. It just wasn't a thing. You know what I mean? Like even if that's who you were, you're kicked out the house. Like a lot of like, you know, not to be, but there's like Caribbean cultures, even Haitian culture, Jamaican culture, you know what I mean? Like just what I grew up around. Yeah. Even African-American culture and urban African-American culture, even though there's a lot of people who are proud that are gay or binary and as they should be, but what they had to grow up with, like what they had to deal with on an everyday, like those individuals literally had to fight for their right to just be able to be for themselves, you know. At least that's how I grew up, you know. So like if you were an openly gay black, it's even weird for me to say, but if you were an openly gay black man in like the hood that I was from, chances are by the time you were 18, 19, you've gotten into 12 fights about your gender. People already knew not to speak about it anymore. You know what I mean? And you got to a point where you literally had to earn a space, or else it was kind of like beaten out of you, or harassed out of you, or you moved out of town. So, you know, I don't like seeing that it's regressing in that sense. When you said there's the trans violence, it's like, damn, because it hasn't changed, right? Because it's like that was definitely the way that it was when I was, you know what I mean? When I was growing up, like, or what I saw in my environments, which was impoverished, like neighborhood Section 8. So it's like you definitely have people who are confident and earn, you know what I mean? It's even fucked to say earned it. Do you know what I mean? Like, but like,
I know what you mean.
Yeah, you get what I'm saying in that sense. But, you know, nowadays to see that even though there's so much visibility, to your point, like there's still the same level of violence, their same level of transgression, right? That they're facing every day. And if not more, because now people just feel like they have a platform to just be able to express their, you know, their bigotry or their divide, even if they don't agree, right? So it's difficult.
I think what we have now that is different and that's good is, in terms of the visibility, is that more people know, right? More people are talking about it. You've got representation. So there's media, there's, you know, there's film, there's TV, there's books, there's people, there are black, like, Janet Mock is one of my favorite trans activists. She's a black trans woman, amazing writer, actress. And she, you know, it's important that we have, you know, like her, Laverne Cox, Dean Spade, like we have all of these people that people can look to, and that is great. And I think that's huge.
Yeah.
Right. But one of my favorite things about thinking about intersectionality is there's a stereotype that communities of color are more homophobic, right? And I don't think it's true, A, but B, when you look at the history of, let's just think about American colonialism, right? Like American Indian genocide. There's a scholar named Andrea Smith who wrote a really awesome book called Conquest, Sexual Violence and the American Indian Genocide. It's not light reading, right? But it's an amazing book. And she talks about how the Christian European colonizers that came and first kind of had contact with Native peoples and how they took over the land, with a lot of it was around gender and sexuality. So that means that, and students understood that and they kind of were horrified by what was going on, but it was hard for them to get like the main point. So I'll try to just like distill it. The fact that gender and sexuality were central to how imperialism and racism worked through colonialism means that we can't think about gender and sexuality and race and ethnicity as separate from one another. Because gender and sexuality is one of the main ways that racism happens, right? That it works. So so for example, you know, sexual violence against women, right? It's a clear example. Also targeting queer and gender nonconforming indigenous people, right? Which there were many cultures that had kind of what we would consider today trans people in their cultures, and they were oftentimes like healers or spiritual, like important people in that group, right? And those people were particularly targeted because they were the gatekeepers of the cultural knowledge. So what this means is that queer people of color are, it's like it's like exponential, right? Because we're not just trying to be queer, we're trying to be queer in the communities that were targeted for being queer to begin with.
Right, yeah.
So that's part, and another one of my favorite scholars, Jose Munoz, wrote about how queer people of color exist kind of in a chasm.
Okay.
Like, so if there's like a cliff here and a cliff here, and we're kind of down here because on the one hand, you have the LGBT movements in the world that are dominantly white, right?
Yes.
And then on this side, you have like the homophobia and transphobia in communities of color. And so you're kind of excluded from both situations. And the reason why that is because of colonialism, because targeting queer and trans people of color was like integral to the founding of this nation state, right?
Oh, wow.
And so once you understand that, it becomes clear how, like, for example, for a white person to be out as trans or gay is different for a person of color, right?
Absolutely.
But it's not
Okay.
because communities of color are more homophobic or transphobic. It's because they're dealing with a whole bunch of other things historically and at present around queerness. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've never really actually thought about how using gender and queerness to like keep racism intact, right? Like you never really look at the weapons that people really, because everyone's just so fixated on monetizing, like monetization, like money,
Right.
financial. Like you don't think that you just use that. There's multiple instruments used to oppress and to keep people down.
Yeah.
So like seeing that is like you never really think about that as an action, right? Like as an action and a thought. So that's wow.
Yeah, exactly.
Revelating, honestly. Eli, what are you thinking? I feel like you're really quiet.
I'm kind of just listening.
I feel like you've really been quiet on this show, bro.
Yeah,
I can kind of feel it.
It's an interesting topic to me. I have a older sister. She's a lesbian woman.
Yeah. Okay.
And I know growing up, I wasn't really that close with her. There's a pretty decent age gap there. I think it's about 7 years. So I kind of just, I was not close to her, but I watched throughout her life. And I know she's obviously very pro LGBTQ movements and all that because she is a lesbian woman herself. But she did have a lot of transgender friends and other gay or lesbian friends. So like, it's different. It's case specific, but my sister, I would say majority of her friends were actually people of color that were gay.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
In comparison to white people, she obviously had both, but I would say majority of her friends were people of color, Spanish. It doesn't matter, but anyone. And those people all had different scenarios with like their parents and things like that. A lot of her friends were kicked out by their families, and a lot of them weren't. And I wish I was able to kind of look back, and be able to look clearly and know which was which and which family supported and why, because I want to know like the cultural reasons behind it.
Well, it's supposed to be unconditional at the end of the day, right?
Yeah,
like,
but I mean,
think it's
obviously
kinda
in this sense, it wasn't.
Yeah.
So,
That goes into this. Like, if it's family oriented, it's like you kind of like reneged on your position as a parent or as like a guardian. That's supposed to be unconditional.
I feel like as a parent, I feel like you kind of you have to roll with whatever the situation is.
Yeah, what does your child's sexuality
really
have
matters.
to do with them as a person, right? Or identity? That'll probably be like my whole thing with it. It's like, while you want to start the hate, you want to stop the spread of violence, but more so it's like, why can't you just accept that is what it is, right? Like they are who they are, and like it shouldn't bother you.
Even if it's not something you like, it shouldn't
bother you.
It is just somebody else in the way that they live life,
right? Like
I've never. Unless somebody's a really bad person, I don't have issues with the way that people live life.
That kind of makes you think, it's like, what is the stigma? What is that trigger? Why do you think that this whole movement, the whole identity thing, like bothers people so much? Like, what about
it's different? It's changed.
Like, why is that like so triggering for someone to be like, oh,
because
well, this is who you identify, you're wrong.
People
like,
are always resistant to change. Like that's literally it. Like,
but to the
hello, like
the more
people are
limelight that
so
gets put on
resistant.
it.
Like that's literally, if you look at any piece of history, like the common denominator is that people are resistant to change.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I'm so
but like
serious.
to the point where you have like doctors trying to prove it and like to making documentaries
but it's like
and
Elijah
podcasts
has,
about it.
but it's like
also, like-
Elijah said on the last episode, like even like when we were like talking about like the robots and stuff like that, like I'm resistant to change when it comes to things like that. Like there's certain things that people can be really, because it even like you just said, like it takes a long, like it took so long for the conversation about the LGBTQ community to even come into conversation. And look at it now, like it's a whole different world now where even they still, like people still experience hate. It's like we've always said on this podcast, there's pros and cons to literally everything. And especially when it comes to as broad of a conversation as gender, like there's obviously gonna be, you know what I mean?
The more
like,
we sit here and
also-
discuss it, I'm starting to think it is a part of that colonial programming. Like that's like they're spewing the hate, which is, you know, they're psychosomatic. They're like on your phones or in media or whatever you're seeing, that for whatever, or even the election or presidency, you see someone say something and they didn't get, there was no ramification for words or whatever. Like you just start getting this platform where somehow you just feel entitled or empowered to speak on somebody's identity or gender like it is pertinent to you. You know, like as if it's even like, it shouldn't even like be a, right? Like if someone says this is,
I think that
this
you should
is
respect somebody regardless. I
Right,
think
yeah.
respect, that's one of the biggest issues I think with the world as a whole is people don't respect each other.
It's like, so where did it become okay?
But isn't it crazy for us to like, I don't know. It's like, obviously everybody says that, but then, people still like have their, little judge, you know what I mean? Like not
everyone judges. You can't
Yeah,
say
and
that
it's
you
so-
don't judge people because it's impressions. It's the things you see about people, the things you notice. But I think the difference between judging someone based off the things you see and then trying to dive deeper into their life when it has nothing to do with you is where the issues really arise.
Where did, like, that's what I'm saying. I'm trying to pinpoint where that trigger happened. Like, where did it just become?
It just got
I don't think it ever became a trigger. I think it was a buildup of so many things, so many events, so many, issues and so many rights being taken away. And it's a combination of it all.
I'm laughing because, so I left Vassar voluntarily.
I wanted to go into why'd you leave.
2023.
In 2023 is when you left.
So now I'm a full-time musician. I have a project called Hen in the Fox House. And part of why I left is because I decided that I was kind of at the end of what I had to give. Teaching is a very like service, I think, oriented, especially when you're teaching.
And I feel like once you're done with teaching,
gender
like, you're done.
studies.
Like, yeah.
And I've always wanted to be a songwriter. Like that's my calling, I guess, if you want to call
your
it
passion.
that. So now I'm writing. Like I have a part-time day job that covers my bills. Anybody who wants to figure out how to be an artist, feel free to reach out because I feel like I've done all the hacks. Like I've read all the things.
You're like, I have a little book,
But I think about it too in terms of, and this I'm grateful for my academic training in this way, that thinking about political economy, right? Because people are stressed out. Like capitalism is not, this stage in particular of late capitalism that we are living under. Like, it's not like people have like oodles of time and energy to spend thinking about new subjects all the time, right? Like people are stressed.
like
people are just trying to make it through the
That
day.
is a big
like,
part. I think that is honestly like 99% of the issue, and what breaks my heart and what I wish people understood about, for example, like Black liberation movements, like especially like the feminist and queer positive ones, is that like it actually would be better for everyone, right? Like rights it's not a piece of pie where if somebody else gets a piece of the pie, you get less pie, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's not how it works. Like we're social movements for rights. Like we're trying to get everybody on a more even playing field. But I think people be stressed out and tired and like they don't have a lot.
All the
all the
time.
time. Yeah.
All the
To
time.
learn about something new, and they don't, it's
No, and
new
people
things.
like you said, people don't want to anymore. Like people are just like,
Yeah.
I honestly like don't, it's like Elijah said, like people are just trying to get through their day-to-day life.
trying to
Like
chill, man.
they're trying to
like-
wake up in the morning, brush their teeth and get out of the house.
Make
like,
some money, get home, do whatever I want.
My
Yeah.
cousin,
I don't care about none of
my
this other
cousin
stuff.
who I love dearly is like, oh, I just can't deal with pronouns. Like, what is the deal with pronouns? I just can't.
Yeah.
And I was like, like just try. It's not actually as hard as you think
Think
it
it
is.
is.
And I remember thinking that before. A lot of queer and trans people were transphobic at one point, right? Like we have this stuff internalized too. So like
Yeah.
I had a lot of those thoughts of like, oh, I don't get that what is that weird thing, right? Like, and that's uncomfortable to say, but it's true. And
Yeah.
and I don't
I
think
think
it's fair for us to be out like
It's just like, I think people don't, as you said, people don't really want to have to learn more stuff.
Yeah.
And especially if it has something, has nothing to do with them. And
also-
it's not something that
Right.
will
But I
like directly impact them. People just don't care.
I also think it has to do with like, just experiences that people have where it's like, for me, when pronouns and like the conversation of, just all of that came into play, it was a lot, not that it was easier for me to understand, but it's like, I used to work at a summer camp where I was surrounded just by a lot more of that because, where we're from and like predominantly, like, not that there isn't that community, I just wasn't necessarily fully immersed in it or a part of
Predisposed to
it.
it.
But then when I went to this summer camp, it was like a completely different lens that I was opened up to. So it was a lot easier for me to understand it and be able to engage in that conversation because I have friends that are a part of that community. Whereas, when I think of myself in the past, obviously it was harder, but so that in a sort of way, I have a sense of not empathy, but like I understand that like it's probably not going to be as easy for some people to understand because they don't have the experiences with those type of people in their community.
Right.
If that makes complete
Yeah,
sense.
totally.
And obviously, like, that's like not an excuse. Like, and like, but it's like you also said too. Like, people are tired, and like it's not. It's not that this should be like something, it's like, oh, well, I have to learn all of this. It shouldn't be that. It should just be that people should be okay with the conversation.
Right.
yeah,
rather
it's
than
be
trying
less
to, like, push
stressed
it
about
off.
It. Like it's
Right.
not
Yeah,
gonna
it shouldn't be a
not
stress.
so
I
I think the
hard.
stress comes a lot too when like things get put into the spotlight a lot. Like, a lot of LGBTQ movements got brought up during political times, and politics are already a lethal
Well,
field.
because so much
So-
of
That's a good
politics
point.
is surrounded by that right now, which is actually,
Well,
it
it's-
infuriates me
it's-
in itself that like
it's
so much of
techniques, it's
politics is like
political
surrounded by that
technique.
because it's like
They
the
do it
fact
every
that like
election.
people, like I understand that like it has to be talked about because, I'm a woman myself. I care about, my rights and everything like that. But the fact that it's even come to this point where it's like now people have based their political campaigns on like whether or not like they're in, pro of women's rights or whether they're not, like that's actually ridiculous when we're literally going backwards. Like I feel like like our system, like even
happens
just
every
like even
election.
just talking about our country in general, like we are literally going backwards. Sorry, but it's like I don't know.
I
It's
think
like
just
really
is
sad
the
and scary to say.
digression of like human morals, really. I mean, it's lack of
Yeah,
respect.
but-
Like to me, it just
Yeah, but
sounds
that's
plain and
no-
simple.
that's nobody's
it's
fault
just
but
like,
our own.
It's weird to me. It's just weird energy to me that someone would announce their pronoun or just announce who they are and how they would like to be introduced, and somebody's initial thought would be like, nah.
Yeah, I'm not gonna-
the overall respect for humanity is like, oh, this is who I am and like how I would like
It's
to
just-
be
it's as you
addressed.
said,
And then you're
people
just gonna
don't
just be
care.
like, nah, like so why, like. What is that? If that we're gonna go backwards, like that's really all it is. There used to be more of like just a natural mutual respect, like for people in general. When
It made it harder. Like part of why I burned out, honestly, it also is because I wasn't just teaching like during the day. Like almost every single person that I brought up my job to outside of work would like. It was almost like I was a therapist, but without any other training. Like they would just like dump all of this stuff on me of like, well, what about this and what about this and help me understand
my
this.
God,
Like I was
right.
like everybody and their moms and dads gender coach.
And you're like,
and it was
like,
exhausting.
You're like, book an appointment.
And
like,
people
I don't
were
have time.
angry. Like people were angry, felt very entitled to kind of like put all this
almost
stuff
like they're
on me.
like it's like they're using you as the conduit for their thought, right?
Yeah.
Like,
I don't just teach it, I am it too, right?
Yeah, right,
When so there's a difference of like, oh, like give us your insider knowledge.
you're a living embodiment of
like,
the,
They want your like, they literally want your like personal book.
And there were a
like,
lot of confused parents that then projected their confusion onto their queer and trans kids and being like, oh, my child is confused. I'm like, no, you're confused. Yeah. Your child's actually like fine. Like they're actually really clear on who they are. You're just not.
I think
you're not able
there was
to
a
like
small
handle
period
it,
though that I
hard.
noticed right around quarantine where there was a lot of people who were confused as to what they were. Even my younger sister told me that she was transgender, and now she is not. And I know a lot of people that had a lot of struggles with gender identity, and I think over that time alone and that period of trying to figure themselves out, when at the same time medias are showing that there's this advancement, now like when you put these things in the spotlight and now all these people are stuck in their homes and they can learn about it, a lot of people will think or maybe identify as they think they're this. Or are they? I'm not going to name specific things, but they could be transgender, gay, lesbian, whatever.
Right.
But I think there was a large period of time over quarantine where people thought they were things that they were not. And I'm not saying that about every person. Obviously, there's people that they're gay, lesbian, whatever. But I do know a lot of people that in the span of a year decided that they were transitioning male to female. And then 2 years later, I see them and they're not anymore. Like that happened. It was a weird shift of people that I think wanted to kind of be part of an awareness for that LGBTQ group, but thought they were part of it when they weren't. Like I know.
Well, I mean, the world I would love to see is where we can just do whatever the F we want to do with our own bodies.
I just don't
if we're not right, like if it's
care.
why not be,
bodily autonomy?
Why
right?
not explore? Right?
Yeah,
like you might.
But I think that leads to why
you don't have confusion later in
became
life.
so
But that's
big.
what it's just interesting from you, like coming from your point of view, being younger though, like they kind of have, and I mean, please I'm treading lightly, and I'm not trying to put myself in like deep waters, but they almost have that freedom to explore. Like he said, just in your experience, I don't know how many people you've witnessed in your life that gone through like an identity like transition, or they've like explored themselves or trying to discover themselves. What?
I couldn't put a real number on it, but it was probably like 8 to 12
just
people
in your span of like going and just me just different, like growing up I maybe knew like 4 or 5 people that were out, that were like open, just period, that were just like open then in their life. Like I count on like one hand, like my school experience, none in middle school, and like all if not most of them came out in high school and like opened up, opened up at that stage. But
like
it's
the
like
maturity level, I think once you get to high school, you kind of really, you have a better understanding of yourself.
Yeah, but I also don't think that there wasn't like, obviously I don't know anyone else's history and I don't look that much into it, but I'm sure there was people that were closeted or like they were like felt hidden, like they couldn't be themselves, in their environments in my time. So it's interesting to hear that from your, because I don't think not one, I'll tell you like, and then even that in my experience, I didn't, though people were out as like, homosexual or like, or even bi at that point, I did not see anyone that was like of like the opposite, like no trans identity in my time. And that was like early 2000s, like maybe even later, like 2010. I went to high school from like 10, 11, right? Like, so I don't even think that was that long ago, like just in my scope of like, so
yeah.
Just now, like just hearing that, it's like, I did not see one, like in my entire experience, and even parts of college that were like actually like openly a trans identified individual, like that they were confident enough to be that. So it's like, okay, I think that is a freedom of expression, right? And you're able to identify, and why not discover yourself now, or in your early, right? That's what it's for, so you don't have any confusion later in life. Because, you know, how many times have I heard stories of middle-aged men, you know, who've been married for however many years, you know, have full families, come out of the closet, you know, because they had some introverted, like, obviously some thought or, you know, convoluted thought of themselves that they weren't able to express.
Yeah, they never,
right? Like,
they never looked into it.
They never looked into it. And maybe
okay.
that could have been addressed. Like, I'm just kind of like, now I'm just ranting, but like, maybe that's something they could have been addressed if they explored it in an earlier stage of their life.
I also think I like that you guys are bringing this up. Because I think trans, to me, I think of trans as like, you know, it means like beyond, across, or through, right?
Okay.
It's like it's a prefix. It's not really a word. It's the beginning of a word.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Could
And
mean
so,
many things.
yeah, there's like sorry, what'd you say?
Could mean many things.
Exactly. So it connotes movement, right? And so I think of it less as an identity and more as like an exploration. I know that sounds really cheesy, but I do think of it like you're not less trans if you transition and then detransition. To me,
Okay.
that doesn't like
What
because
is it?
it's more about the movement than about a stable location for some people.
But so that's interesting to me though, because if somebody, I mean, the way I've always looked at it as having like a sister who is lesbian, you know, there's always the argument. People always love to say that some people say it's not a choice, or some people say it's a choice, whatever.
Right. Yeah.
I feel like, you know, just from what I've seen firsthand experience, I am more inclined. I'm inclined to believe that there is people that are born like certain ways. Like you're either born, you are going to be a lesbian woman, or you're going to be born as a man, but you're going to transition later in life to this woman or whatever. But there's also, I think there is people that just they for a second will identify with something they see in being gay or lesbian or transgender, and they'll identify themselves as that, and then realize that's not fully who they are and detransition. But to me, if somebody's able to make that change, because that's I mean, it's not like, it's none of my business, but to me, that's a pretty like big change. Like if I transition from a man to a woman, to me, I feel like that would be a big change for me. So to say that you're that and then transition back leads me to believe that it is almost a choice in some sense. Not for every person, not saying everybody has the choice to be gay or transgender or whatever, but I think like, even the other day I was on TikTok, I saw this woman, she posted a video with her friend, and she was like, I won't refer to her as a real woman because she changed her bio to they/them as a trend in quarantine. And there was like 60,000 comments of people saying that they also changed their bios to different pronouns or things like that to follow a trend. And, you know, that I feel like that is what leads people to have such hostile views on the LGBTQ scene, because there's not to say that somebody's a real transgender person or fake.
I just like the media, like that's just like through the media's lens, like, you know what I mean?
Do you feel like you've experienced that?
Really
like that you've like had conversations with people who just were talking to you or like postulating in a sense like they were just trying to be trendy, like they just wanted to sound insightful? Or you feel like you just get mostly genuine people that are exploring? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
I don't.
Because I just feel like there's a difference. Like that's where I think a lot of the hate for these groups will come from, is the people that, you know, they don't really feel that way. They just don't understand how they feel, and they try to latch on to something to give themselves a sense of identity. You know, like my younger sister, she was almost she was convinced that she was not a woman. She didn't feel like a woman. She never told me she felt like a man, but she never felt like a woman. So she cut her hair super short for like 2 years, and then now is like the most like straight cisgendered woman ever. And I don't understand how like that can change that drastically in a span of like a year. To me that's a difference between somebody who is like real versus not real in the LGBTQ sense. Like my older sister, I would say and I'm not saying that like if you it's hard to explain. Like, I'm not trying to offend anybody in particular.
It's fine. This is the discussion.
My older sister, she's been lesbian ever since, I knew that she was a lesbian growing up. I could tell just because of the type of person she was and the things that she enjoyed in comparison. Like, and there's nothing wrong with that, but I knew that she wasn't straight, and I think it was easier to tell. But then there's people that will tell me that they're gay or they're lesbian or transgender, and I kind of get the sense that they're not. And then those people later on end up reverting to something else or changing their identity or finding something else that they identify with. And that's what I mean when I say like real or not real.
Yeah.
Is I think there's people that don't, they're 14 years old. They don't understand what they are, who they are. They don't have that purpose. And they see these people online talking about how when they were 14, they felt like that and they ended up transitioning into a man or a woman or something like that. So I think it gives them, almost like a sense of hope, like maybe that's what I have, or that's how I feel. That's who I am.
Well, I think it's about creating a safe space, right, for people to express themselves, to explore.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's the point, right? Like to be able to, so you said it's not about where you end up, it's about the movement.
Again,
in it, right?
thinking structurally, right? This is where it's helpful to think structurally, because I think we have to be really careful to get into a politics of authenticity, right?
Yeah.
Of who is really, what does gay really mean, or what does trans really mean? Because that opens up a whole nother box of worms. But
Absolutely.
thinking structurally, like, I love this quote from Borderlands, which is a fabulous book by Gloria Anzaldúa. She's one of the early Chicana feminist writers in the 80s. And she says, like, what she uses, I believe she uses the term two-spirit or like double spirit, because she's writing about indigeneity and Mexican-American queerness. And she says, like, what we are suffering from is not a confusion about who we are, but this despot societal idea that we have to be one thing, right? Yeah. And that one thing looks a certain way. So when you think about a term like normativity, I know it sounds like super academic, but it's a useful concept because it describes, like, not what's normal, but the idea of that there is a normal, right? So the concept that we have that like heterosexuality is more normal.
Yeah.
Whereas it's not. Like there are more, statistically, there are more heterosexual people. There are more cis people than trans people. But I always say, like, you can't have clear statistics on who's queer and who's trans and who's not.
Yeah, because not everyone is
in a homophobic, transphobic society.
Yeah.
Like, there is no way to get that data and have it be accurate because we have internalized all of those ideas about who we're supposed to be, right? Like,
yeah.
And
I think identity is just, I think people, a lot of the times with identity and who you are, people aren't true to themselves. I think people want to fit into things, like, the people you're around do shape you into the person you are. If you
we're wired to be.
If you dropped all your friends right now and changed the group of people you're with every day, you would probably change as a person. So there's a different sense of who you actually are in comparison to what people want you to be, I think.
Yeah, well, it goes like back to like the beliefs that it's like gender's like a social construct. You know what I mean? Like the whole conversation about it and all of it wouldn't exist without every single one of us and without every single person.
Right. The starting point, the assumption is that there is this normal thing, and then if you divert from that, then you're in the LGBTQ, alphabet.
Anything,
I think difference is also seen as
plus,
wrong a lot of the times. Like just because something is different doesn't mean that it's wrong.
Yeah.
It's like doing if you did a math homework in 10 different ways.
We're taught that.
It's like just because it's like I remember being in school and I would be getting math problems done correctly, but they would tell me I'm not doing them the right way, so I'd get the wrong grade.
Yeah.
It's like, how am I wrong? I'm getting the right answer. Like, you know what I mean? It's the wrong and right in that scenario are not defined correctly.
Well, if we're talking about identity, we're going into the general view. It's like how many people don't even know who they are when they're adults, right? That are still just trying to discover themselves. like throughout their life. So I think it's just very.
Well, I think that the discovery of yourself is something that's ever changing, and it's
Yeah.
something that continues to happen every single day. You know what I mean? It's something that you find out about. Like, you can find out a new thing about yourself every single day, or you can also find out just once a year. But it's like there's still something. And I don't think that, I've always thought this too, I don't think that you as a person fully change, but I think that you grow from the person that you were. Like, you still stand to a lot of those values and things that you grew up knowing and like being very fond of and being aware of, and then you just take those beliefs and those notions and put them into your like future life.
Yeah, I'm a little bit on the opposite end. I think people are constantly
I kind of disagree
changing.
with that a little bit, just because I think
but I don't think like you can fully change as a person, because
you can.
Oh,
Definitely
I'm the definition of that.
Because I mean, listen,
I'm the embodiment
the
of
person
that.
you are is very heavily based on the situations you're in. I mean, if you're a homeless man on the side of the San Francisco street, and then I give you $1 billion, that person who was on the street is a very different person than that person with $1 billion. Like, your life is, there's no change. It's going to be different no matter what. But
things are always going to be different. But growth is a form of change.
Yes, but I think growth stays with you forever. It's not something that change. Like, even if you don't have access to it, it's part of who you are as a person.
Right? Yeah.
You know,
I hear what you
your
guys
life
are both
experience
saying.
is formed you as to who you are.
I would see both sides of that.
And but you also do have control over who you are, in the sense that, like, even if you went through the hardest life of all time, you can choose to view things in only positive lights. You can choose to look at things in only negative lights.
One of my best friends always says, everyone has free will. It's just your choice on how you choose to use it.
Free will is
crazy. Free will is actually the
world.
craziest thing in the world.
Part of why I love the term queer is because of how capacious it is, right? Like, it can hold space for
so many different things.
Things. And when I came out as trans, one of the most supportive things that one of my friends said to me was like, 'cause I was embarrassed. You know, I was like 29. I was like, how did I not figure this out?
Yeah, you're like,
that was before I had the whole structural thing. Yeah. I'm like, I didn't find it out because people didn't want me to know about it, right?
They didn't want you to.
Accidental. Yeah. Especially as a Latino. Are you kidding me? But like, kind of to contradict what I was saying earlier. But like, I just lost my train of thought. Oh no, my friend was like, "What is life for if not to explore who you are?"
Life is meant to live, like, not just hide in the shadows.
So like, my kind of honest response is like, who cares if they're really trans? Who cares if they're, who cares what people are like? Can we just have this space?
Who gives a fuck? Like, who gives a shit?
It shouldn't trigger.
I only brought that up because I feel like that is one of the reasons.
No, I'm glad that you brought it up. It's an open. This is an open discussion. Yeah. Like, I'm glad that we're.
And the idea of it being a trend is interesting.
Well, yeah,
I mean, if you look up, I wish I could find that video. There was like 60,000 people in that comments that said they literally. They were pretending to be something that they didn't feel like they were because other people were talking.
I can see the controversy of it, like almost like you're jumping on the coattails of.
Yeah. I feel like that's disrespectful. In my eyes.
There's attention on it. It's being highlighted. It's your opportunity to start a conversation. We don't know what a lot of human nature is weird. We don't know what a lot of people's real intents are.
Well, I think about like the appropriation of Black culture too. Yeah. Like, people do that all the time with like when it became Black music,
when
Black
it became
art,
commercial.
Like whatever is like, there are singers who change the way that they sing to sound a certain way in certain genres, and it makes me uncomfortable. Like, I don't want to like. I'm not saying everybody should feel uncomfortable. But I think you should sing the way that you talk. Like, it confuses me when people don't sing the way that they talk, or when they start singing and they have like a different.
Say that just like. I've always thought this. Like it's like how British people like sing in an American accent. I'm like, how are you doing that? That is so.
I mean, Adele is like one of the best singers in the world. Like, I'm not criticizing her, but I don't, as a singer myself, like, I don't understand why you wouldn't want to just sound like the way you sound. Like, why are you trying to sound like something else? And that's less of an accent thing and more of like a timbre thing too, because there are some people who try to sound. Yeah, I think, like, if anybody has a chance to, like, if you want to, like, take a women's studies course or like delve deeper into these topics, I think it's important, because if you don't educate yourself about it, you're in the danger of like reproducing harms, right?
Yeah,
or
yeah.
like kind of
Getting caught into the rhetoric.
And I
right?
think
limiting yourself.
I think that's like a great way to like
We can,
to like even close off, just because what, like you said, like more people should be open just to the conversation of all the topics that we just discussed and learning more about it, and people should be more receptive and less resistant to the conversation. And I think a lot of things would change.
I definitely think we should just be more welcoming to people expressing themselves and finding their identity. Like, I think it should be a controversy.
It shouldn't be a heated topic.
Like, yeah.
People I think people just love to argue things for no reason.
Like, it shouldn't be a heated discussion.
To argue something that doesn't like affect you negatively in any way, there's no reason to do that.
Kind of just want to accept people for their.
So it's like if I looked at you right now, Branden, and I was like, I was really upset that you're wearing a green flannel.
Well, I
your pants are
I'm furious.
Too short.
I'm furious.
Yo, I know
now.
they are really short. Well, luckily they're not on camera.
Those might fit me.
That's like, oh yeah, they're not on
Pan
camera today.
Pan that camera down to his bottom of the. Oh.
No.
For real. They're the dust masters. Stop.
The swamp monsters.
I love it. They're the swamp masters. I mean, I really stopped putting so much pertinence to that thought when I heard the saying that, there's 9 billion people on this planet and you're 9 billion versions of you out there. Mm-hmm. You're someone different to every single person that you encounter, no matter what
Just be true to yourself.
You know what I mean? No matter what you portray or what you try to be.
It's very easy.
That was so
very easy.
What was that?
Just be true to yourself.
I love him.
Don't change who you are for other people either.
Exactly. Just got to stay authentic, right?
I would love if you guys wanted to have another conversation at some other point about the man question.
The man question, please.
Versus, and women, because we talked a lot about queer and trans, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, but I think we are at a really interesting time, and gender studies isn't just thinking about women and trans people, it's also thinking about masculinity, right?
Yeah.
And
that's a whole nother topic.
we haven't even cracked, but
I mean, it's a part of the spectrum, right? It's on there, right? The toxic masculinity,
really important, and toxic masculinity. We don't talk as much about like non-toxic masculinity.
Yeah, did you hear the theory on toxic masculinity?
What?
Where like the whole thought of it, right? Have you guys heard it? Where like toxic masculinity, right? Majority of men in America, live in split homes, split households. That's we don't need to go on a stat-based fact, but like it's like 2 out of every 4 men, it's like 2 out of every 5, right? Live in a household that is a single mother household, like where there's a matriarch and they live in a single mother household. And then 80% of the educators are women. So it's like some people said that toxic masculinity is really a man who doesn't know how to be masculine. Like he's portraying like the worst versions of feminine qualities that he picks up from women in his life because he thinks that those are firms, like those are points of like whenever he was reprimanded or whenever he got in trouble in life, it came from a majority of the time, it came from a woman or a feminine outlook, right? So like you have to look at like if we're looking at the broader scope in the sense of like if I'm a man that was raised by predominantly women and I was educated by predominantly women and every time I was reprimanded or every time I got in trouble, it came from the views and the lens of a woman. And now I'm trying to be a man in society, but I never really had the constructs and the upbringing of a true positive male figure. I might have role models, I might have influences from like friends and family, right, that were exterior that I could take note of, but I wasn't cultivated under a masculine or a positive masculine environment. That would be fair to say in that assessment, right? Because there wasn't, right? You might have had like a stepdad or something, but we already know that's a very, right? That could be a very contentious topic to begin with, right? So then now I'm trying to be masculine, or I'm trying to emulate or portray this sense of masculinity, but all I know is the ways that I was reprimanded or punished from a feminine lens.
Well,
right? Like, so
two quick responses to that, because I know we need to wrap up, but in some ways that sounds like a way to blame toxic masculinity on women.
I can see why. I'm just looking at
that's the first thing. And the second thing is that even when there is a man in the house who is the dad, it's not necessarily a good representation of masculinity.
Ever.
Right?
Yeah. No, absolutely.
So, so it's.
But that's like,
Yeah. But again, thinking structurally, like we need to think about the ways that toxic masculinity is, it's our founding fathers, right? It's part of colonialism, imperialism, this idea of like might makes right, of, if you have the power, a lot of people who think, who like my friend, for example, one of my best friends, voted for Trump 3 times, right? And we get into it all the time, but he's one of my best friends, and I'm proud to have like friends of all different views and stuff. I think it's
a sign of maturity.
Important. But in his mind, there was like cowboys versus Indians, and the good guys won, right? The cowboys won. Joke's on him, because the first cowboys were actually Mexican. But right, there's this idea that like, colonialism wasn't a problem, like the people who should have won. And that's a fundamentally different way of looking at it, right? Yeah. But if we think about toxic masculinity starting with manifest destiny, starting with white supremacy, this idea that we have better morals, right? Because we're religious, we understand who God is, and God is telling us to take this land and set up, right? These savages don't know what they're doing. They're not using the land for what it's supposed to be used for, right? All of the kind of narratives imperialism and colonialism. So toxic masculinity, is that's our blueprint for what masculinity is, right? Somebody who it's a doer, right? Not necessarily a thinker. I don't know if you guys remember when Obama was president, he was constantly criticized for thinking too much. So there's even something against like, you're too passive. You have to constantly be doing action, even and not even think about it, right? Mm-hmm. So anyways, it's a part of a longer conversation, but
I would love to one of these days.
I think it is changing, and I think a lot of men are having, like, there's some space opening up for them to have introspection about their emotional life, like the mental health podcast that you guys did right before that.
Have that conversation, right?
Yeah.
No, it's a lot to talk about. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having
real.
me.
I honestly, it's a very insightful piece. I'm glad we're getting into these topics, right? And like we're creating that space to have the discussion. I went on my tangent about toxic masculinity, and
you guys gave me a lot to think about too. Thank you for all your thoughts and questions.
Yeah.
I know you had a lot to say on that, didn't you? I know you had a lot of thoughts on that.
I'm going to keep my thoughts to myself on that one, but that's just me, and everybody knows that.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for coming on. And
my pleasure.
Thank you to my co-hosts, as always. Shout out to Q29. We love you guys. And that's it.
Yeah, it's a wrap.
Peace out.
It's a wrap on the day.